All right, you have added basic sounds to your game. So now let's talk about ambience, music, and leveling everything out. So ambience and music are going to work together to set the mood of the game. Pretty much exactly like they did in film. So think about what is the environment of your game and how can you recreate that sonically. As with film, you're going to use a stereo recording as your source for ambience, but you're going to put it into a 3D event. In that event, select the master fader for the event and turn distance attenuation to off so that it stays at a constant level throughout the level, even when you're moving. Then you're going to set the min and max distance to cover the entire game area, so literally to min and max respectively. Then what I like to do is to create a new empty object in Unity and add an FMOD emitter to it, place that at the center of the game, and then that is where you're going to put your ambience event. You'll notice that it's going to sound a little odd, but we can adjust that. So go back to FMOD, set the envelope on the ambience's master track to user, and adjust the sound size. Now, as far as music goes, what music sets the mood of the game and how does it fit into the sonic world of the game? So just a couple of things you should really look at. You can find these on YouTube, although I'm sure most of you have probably played quite a few of these. Super Mario Brothers, Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy VI, specifically the opera scene, and 7, Genova's theme. Donkey Kong Country, the underwater level in particular, Transistor, Celeste, Breath of the Wild, Grand Theft Auto 5, where you have the in-car radio. It's really great for creating a scene. The sound of Halo 4, the music there. Skyrim, Splendor, the iPhone app, has a great and really fitting set of music. And there's so many more. So think about your favorite games, listen to the music in those, and think about how that really sets the mood and how it helps to create the world that you inhabit in the game. What we're going to do with music is we're going to look at how to avoid repetition by using obvious melodies or phrases as loops. Instead, we're going to use generative composition techniques, things like random walks in a scale, slow pads, using really long loops, where the longer the loop is, the less the repetition is likely to be noticed. We can also use randomization of different aspects of the tracks in FMOD, and we can compose different parts to the song in your DAW. So, for example, you'd have multiple drum parts for the verse, multiple bass parts for it, etc., that we can then randomize based on different parameters in FMOD. And we are definitely going to randomize things just to kind of keep everything moving forward and have it nice and interesting throughout and not fall into like a static loop. So there's two types of randomization that we're really going to focus on, vertical and horizontal. In vertical randomization, you are composing different parts to your song in your DAW. So again, multiple drum parts, multiple bass parts, etc., that all go pretty well together and that then can be randomized. So you're going to export those parts, then you're going to import and create a 2D event in FMOD. Then make sure you're using beats and not time. So right-click in the logic track to set the tempo to whatever your music is in your DAW, whatever you set that initial tempo to, and then make sure that you move that flag to the start of the track. Then you're going to right-click and create a multi-instrument on the audio track and insert the parts for one instrument. So you'll create a track and a multi-instrument for the bass. You'll create a track and a multi-instrument for the drums, a track and a multi-instrument for the melody, etc. Then, in the deck, you can go down and right-click and set the play percentages for those different parts of the multi-instrument so that it will randomly select based on the probability that you give for each of the parts inside that multi-instrument. Once that's done, you can loop the event. And then again, add the other instruments that form that part of the music. And do the exact same thing. Just make sure, again, that they are the same length in your DAW. We talked in class about how having reverb tails is kind of a problem, so you should avoid that. This is why. You can also add single instruments for flourishes. To do that, add the instrument, then go to Trigger Behavior, turn on Probability, and adjust until it fits your taste. This would be things like adding maybe the occasional cymbal crash or different sped up trap beat or ratcheting effect that you have as a separate instrument. And remember, you can add randomization to any parameter, but volume and pan are probably going to be the best. So we'll look at how to do this in class. I realize that's a lot to take in. The other way to do this is you can do what's called horizontal randomization. So you can actually build this off of the vertical randomization and have both. But again, you're going to have your musical parts ready to go, then set your tempo, add either the single or the multi-instrument on a track and loop it. Then you're going to add another single or multi-instrument immediately after the first one and loop that. Then you will right-click in the logic track and add a third loop region that covers both looped regions all the way through from the beginning to the end. Then you're going to move the second loop, the second smaller loop, above that long loop. So you're going to have what you'll see in the picture on the next slide. This will keep the timeline cursor in that long loop and will allow it to do some really, really interesting stuff once we click on the first small loop and set the probability for it to play, then click on the second small loop and set the probability that that will play. And of course, like I said, we can combine this with vertical randomization as well. And you'll get something that looks a little bit like this on the next slide. So this is what I'm talking about. I have a drum loop, a bass loop, and a flourish, and they're all one loop region. You can see with the smaller loop right above that first set of multi-instruments. And then I have another set of drum and bass, and that is the second part, and that is also a looped region. But between those two looped regions in the logic tracks, I have a long loop region that spans the entire segment. And it does have to be set up like this so that that long one is playing throughout and the first one is lower and the second one is above. That way it will always stay within that long looped region, and then you get the ability to randomize the chances that loop 1 or loop 2 will play back. Okay, again, we'll look at that in class. That's a lot to take in. It's kind of hard to set up the first time. But the next thing we need to talk about is leveling and making sure that everything stays at or below a consistent volume threshold. So we're going to level in FMOD, which will give us the ability to control things before passing it on to Unity. We can add effects either in the deck or on return tracks in the FMOD mixer. Things like reverb, convolution reverb. This is why I said do not add reverb on your tracks in your DAW. We can do multi-band EQing. We can do a 3-channel EQ. We can do a channel mixer, which is individual gain for each channel in a signal. This is not an EQ, but it's individual gain for each channel in that signal. We've got a really cool chorus where it's slightly different from the classic version that you know and love, where here it modulates pitch by speeding up the rate, but simultaneously slowing down the sample playback. This does not work well for music, but it's really cool for sounds if you want to get variation in different sounds. There is, of course, a compressor and a limiter, which are necessary. There is distortion. There is delay. There is a flanger. There is a pitch shifter, which uses fast Fourier transform sizes, which must be factors of 2. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 5, 12, 1024, etc., etc. Higher quality you go as you go up, but also higher CPU usage for the final game, so be aware of that. There's also a tremolo effect, and finally there is a transceiver, which lets you transmit or receive a signal from one event to another event using 32 channels that you can send and receive on. This is essentially like using virtual buses. It is very powerful for creating stem mixes that are tied to different events in FMOD. But it is a little bit complicated, so we're probably not going to look at that one in class. For leveling, what you need to do is have an audio track in an event and set the audio output of other audio tracks in the event to go to it. And you can do this in the timeline, and that will create an instant summing bus. As long as everything is all in the same event and you have that blank audio track where everything else in the event is outputting to it, it just sums and you can adjust the volume up and down as needed. Another way to level in the timeline is you can add a return track in the timeline of an event, put effects on it, just down in the deck area, and then in the effect section of other tracks in the event, send them to the return. That can also be really useful to edit the level of individual things within the timeline for an event. The sends can be pre or post. Pre is on the left side of the volume, and post is on the right. You are probably going to do post for everything. But more likely, you're going to level in the mixer. And to do this, you're going to create group submixes for events. This makes it really easy to turn down things proportionally. So you could create a group of player sounds, a group of enemy sounds, a group of weapon sounds, a group of box sounds if you are doing things like moving boxes in your game. Then to do that, all you have to do is select the events you want to group, right-click, and then just choose Reroute into New Group. But you can also create groups and then drag events into them. Just right-click in the Groups tab and create New Group. And yes, you can group groups as well. So you can have a hierarchy, and then everything will mix up until you get to that top level group. You can also add custom mixer views using the plus button, and that is really good for working on the submixes. I like to have one submix per group. There are also VCA tracks. These are faders that let you control tracks that may or may not be in the same group. We're probably not going to have to do it, but if you really need to, you select the tracks, you right-click and assign to VCA. Unlike a group, they're not summing signals, so you cannot use effects on them, but they are useful for controlling some things that are not in the same group. Like if you have player weapon sounds and enemy weapon sounds, and they both have a rocket launcher, and you want to be able to control the overall volume of that, you could send the player rocket event and the enemy rocket event to a VCA and then use that to adjust the volume up and down. And VCA tracks will show up under the VCA tab in FMOD, but again, we're probably not going to use them in class. What's important, though, in the mixer is the idea of loudness. How loud is the total perceptual output of your game? So if you click on the master track in the mixer, you can add the loudness meter effect as a post fader effect. What we're going to do is set the target to -24 LUFS or loudness units. Do not exceed that. That is the standard output format for volume for the Sony PS4, among others. And that is the ceiling. It is not to exceed that. So we can then go back to the events and play individual events and see where they're at, and then mix them down as needed. We can also use live mixing, which we'll talk about in a second, and which we will definitely spend some time on in class. But in the loudness meter, again, set the target to negative 24 LUFS and check the integrated loudness meter. If you right-click on it, it goes between absolute scale, which should never go above negative 24, and it goes to relative scale as well if you right-click on it, which shows how far away in loudness units it is away from the target, either plus or minus, which is extremely useful. Finally, you have the range, which shows you the dynamic difference in loudness units between your loudest and softest sections. So if it feels like something's way, way, way too soft in the game, this is where that will show up. If you see, hey, you've got a range difference of 50 loudness units, probably want to adjust that softer one. But live mixing is a really cool thing we can do. This allows you to run Unity and make changes to things and monitor the loudness in FMOD. To do that in Unity, we're going to go to the Edit menu, Project Settings, Player, Resolution and Presentation, and make sure that the Run in Background option is on. Then, in Unity, we're going to go to the FMOD menu and Edit Settings, and in the inspector that pops up, we're going to make sure that Play in Editor is on. At this point, we can start the game and switch over to FMOD, and then at the bottom of the screen, you will have noticed there's a little box that says Live Update Off. At this point, click on that, and it will connect to game. And since this is all going to be done on the same computer, just leave IP to localhost and hit connect. And now, you can make changes to the mixer in FMOD in real time. But be aware that the changes will not print. They will not be saved until you save your FMOD session and build your banks as normal, and then you'll have to restart the game for them to really take effect. This is really, really useful. I really like this. I will usually have FMOD running in a window and then the game running in another window and go through and edit things like that and make sure that I'm not exceeding that native 24 LUFS threshold. Adjust things as needed and just be very, very conscientious of where I'm setting my volume. So again, we will look at this in class. This is just getting the procedure out of the way now.